So in this lecture, we're going to look at organisms and their environment, and specifically look at ecology. So we're going to start off by talking about what is ecology. Ecology is the study of the interactions of living things have with each other and with their environment. And the study or the science of ecology can provide the understanding needed to solve environmental problems. However, ecology is not the same thing as environmentalism. The function of ecology is to describe interactions that affect the living world, not to work on behalf of the environment. So if we go back and review our hierarchy of life, the beginning of the course really focused on the building blocks. We talked about molecules and atoms. We talked about organelles, cells, etc. And so now we're moving on to more macro scale. And so we are going to focus on starting with population. And remember that a population is all of one species living together at a given time. A community is going to be all living things living together. So a community would be like in your neighborhood, you and the plants that are there and the animals that are there. So all the living things combined. An ecosystem is all the living and the non-living. So you're talking not only about living things, but what we call the abiotic factors as well, the non-living components. Water, temperature, etc. And then lastly, we have our biosphere, which is all of the ecosystems put together. So if we look at the study of ecology, it can be divided into several subspecies. If we talk about organismal ecology, this is concerned with evolutionary adaptations that individual organisms have to meet the challenges posed by their abiotic environment. So what types of adaptations do they have that allow them to survive in their ecosystem? Population ecology is going to address populations. So again, groups of individuals of the same species living in the same area. This is going to concentrate mainly on factors that affect population density, right? The number of individuals in a particular area, as well as population growth. And then lastly, we have our community ecology, which is concerned with communities. And again, that's all the organisms that inhabit a particular area. And it focuses on how interactions between species affects a community. So both its structure and its organization. So basically, how do organisms interact with their environment, or with each other, I should say, right? So predator-prey relationships, etc. Ecosystem ecology is concerned with ecosystems. This includes all the abiotic factors, again, non-living, in addition to the community species in a certain area. This focuses on things like energy flow and the cycling of chemicals among the various abiotic and biotic factors. So again, whenever you see bio, think life. So the biotic factors would be the living components. Abiotic means without life. Those are the parts of the ecosystem that are non-living. Now, many different factors can potentially affect an organism's interaction with its environment. Again, the biotic factors are going to be all of the organisms of the area. This is the living component of the environment, and this will include things like competition, predation, disease, etc. The abiotic factors are the environment's non-living components. This includes chemical and physical factors such as temperature, light, water, minerals, and air. When we talk about an organism's habitat, that is the specific environment that it lives in. This includes both the biotic and the abiotic factors of its surroundings. So, question for you. A community and all the non-living elements that interact with it, so the sunlight, nutrients, etc., is called red population group, yellow biosphere, green ecosystem, blue biome, or purple, a social system. So when you're ready, push pause, and then when you're ready to check your answer, go ahead and push play. So let's answer this. So a community and all the non-living elements is going to be referred to as an ecosystem, right? So an ecosystem is the community, all the living components, with the non-living elements as well. So the answer is green, ecosystem. So when we go through our ecology lecture, we're going to go based on our hierarchy of life. So we will start with population dynamics. We will then move on to talk about communities, and then we will finish this lecture talking about ecosystems. So again, a population is a group of individuals of the same species that occupy the same general area. Populations are influenced by density. So again, the number of individuals per unit area or volume. The structure, so such as the relative number of individuals of different ages. So what you're going to see is that depending on the population structure, that is going to influence your population size. So if you have a greater percentage of your population that is of elderly age, you would expect that your population is going to decrease. If you have a relatively high number of people of younger ages, you would expect population size to increase, etc. And so we will look at these different ways that these are influenced. Populations are influenced by size, so the number of individuals, as well as the growth rate, which is the rate of change in population size. Population ecology is the study of populations in relations to environment, including environmental influences on the density and the distribution, the age structure, and the population size. So population density is again the number of individuals of a species per unit of area or volume. And so ecologists can employ several means to estimate the size of populations of living things. Among them can include counting animal droppings or surveying bird populations as they migrate. So they can tag or mark animals and then follow them and use those to help count which animals have already been counted versus those that have not been, to get a better idea of the number of those animals in a given area. They can also count the population in a smaller representative area and then make an estimation of the total population size. And so they would have to pick an area that should be representative, meaning they're not going to pick an area where they're going to have the least number of those organisms. They're not going to pick an area where they're going to have the most number of organisms. But in order to accurately extrapolate the entire population size, they need to find a region that is representative of the population. And so there's several ways that population density can be measured. Obviously, with animals versus plants, it gets a little more tricky because animals are mobile. So population size fluctuates as individuals are born, immigrate into the area, so move into the area, emigrate away, so move out of the area, and die. So all of these things are going to affect the population size. And so we're going to talk about that there are two broad types of growth patterns that we can see. What is called exponential growth and what is called logistic growth. So the first one that we're going to talk about is exponential growth. And so this is rapid growth that is seen in living populations, and it's known as a J-shaped curve. And so what happens in an exponential growth is that the rate of increase keeps accelerating. And so this describes the expansion of a population in an ideal unlimited environment. So as you get more and more individuals within the population, the rate at which that population increases is going to go up quite a bit because, again, it's proportional to the number of individuals that were in the population. So as your population gets larger, the rate at which the population size grows is going to get larger very quickly. But again, this can only happen in an ideal unlimited environment. Is that likely to be sustained forever? Answer is no, right? At some point, you're going to reach a maximum that the ecosystem can sustain. So populations that initially grow, but whose growth later levels out, have experienced logistic growth. And this is sometimes referred to as an S-shaped growth curve. So notice that it's going to initially grow, and it starts out with what looks like exponential growth, but eventually it levels off. This is referred to as logistic growth. Now, in a minute, you're going to see why does this population size level off? Well, that is going to be something that's known as the carrying capacity. Basically, the maximum amount that a population can grow because of limiting factors that are in the environment. So it might be that there's not enough food. It could be that there's not enough space, right? There are a lot of limiting factors that can influence how a population changes. Now, in the real world, population size is likely to vary in more complex patterns, meaning that the population is going to increase, it's going to decrease, it will increase, decrease. You might see these very complex patterns. Notice here this K, that is that carrying capacity that I was discussing, right? The maximum that the population can go. Notice that for a period of time, you might see the population go above the carrying capacity, but it can't be sustained. And so that's when you're going to see the population then decrease, right? Because if your population goes above that, there's not going to be enough food, and that's going to end up negatively affecting that population. And the population size would then start to decrease. So, question for you. If the growth of a population forms an S-shaped growth curve, this is an example of red arithmetic growth, yellow exponential growth, green exhibitionist growth, blue logical growth, or purple logistic growth. So go ahead and pause, think of your answer, and when you're ready, push play. If you said logistic growth, that is correct. So the logistic growth, purple, is the one that has the S-shaped curve. So again, it's going to initially increase in population size, but eventually it will level out. Yellow exponential growth, remember that that is our J-shaped curve. So the population is going to increase exponentially, and it can do so if the organism is in an ideal environment. Arithmetic growth would be that the population just increases at a steady rate. And that's because in arithmetic growth, it's not dependent on the number of organisms already in a population. So it could be like if you had a factory that produces cars, you're not going to make cars faster just because you already have some. It happens at a constant rate. The rate at which you make the cars is going to be constant. That would be arithmetic growth. But exponential, as your population gets larger, the population size is going to increase faster. And so that's why for exponential growth, you end up with your J-shaped curve. So what has intervened to account for the difference between the dizzying increase of the J-shaped curve and the more moderate increase of the S-shaped curve? And so the answer is that the size of living populations is kept in check by environmental resistance, defined as forces of the environment that act to limit population growth. This includes limited food supply, accumulation of waste products, increased competition. So again, as you get more of those organisms, getting food is going to be more difficult. Increased predation. so it's easier for predators potentially to find them, which would limit the population, etc. There are very many environmental resistances that an organism might encounter. So the carrying capacity, denoted as the letter K, is the maximum population density of a given species that can be sustained within a defined geographical area over an extended period of time. And the carrying capacity is dependent on several things. One, dependent on the species. So different species have different amounts in terms of their carrying capacity. Like bacteria take up very little space, for example. They would have a very high carrying capacity. The number of individuals could be much higher than, say, a whale population. So the carrying capacity will depend on the species as well as the amount of resources that are available in that habitat, because each habitat might have a different amount of resources available to those organisms. So exponential growth in living populations can be calculated by subtracting the population's death rate from its birth rate, which is going to give you the population's growth rate. Denoted as the letter R, this rate is also known as the population's intrinsic rate of increase, and it can be thought of as a population's potential for growth. So an example would be, let's say that we start with a population of 1,000, and there are 100 births per year. Therefore, the birth rate would be 0.10 or 10% per year. So the 100 births out of 1,000 in the population. There are 80 deaths per year. Therefore, the death rate would be 0.08 or 8% per year. And so the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, and therefore the intrinsic rate of increase, would be 2% or 0.02. So in that case, your population is going to be growing because your birth rate is higher than your death rate. So this is just looking at a graph, looking at the intrinsic rate of increase. So if we have an R value of 0, that means that the population growth is 0. Your population is not getting any bigger. It's not getting any smaller, because in that case, birth rate is equal to death rate. So the size of your population stays the same. If we end up with a negative intrinsic rate of increase, if your population starts to decrease, that can mean that your death rate is higher than your birth rate. And as a result, the population size is going to decrease. Now, the higher the R value, the more that population grows. So notice if we compare an intrinsic rate of increase of 0.02 versus 0.06, 0.06 means that the population is increasing faster. The rate at which it's growing is going to be faster. So some populations have a regular boom-bust cycle, meaning that the populations go up and then they go down. And this can especially be the case for predator-prey relationships. So what we're looking at is we're looking at population sizes over time. And the blue is the snowshoe hare. And the red is going to be the lynx, which is the predator. So notice that as my snowshoe hare population goes up, as food becomes more available, then kind of lagging behind that, you're going to see the lynx population go up. Now, as the lynx population goes up, as there are more predators, now more snowshoe hares are going to be eaten, and so their population is going to go down. Well, as their population goes down, not as much food is available. Now the lynx population goes down. As there are not as many predators, now we see the snowshoe hare population go up. Now more food is available. Now the lynx population goes up, and so on and so forth. And so you see this kind of up and down occurring all dependent on predator and prey numbers, because if you are a predator, the more prey that are available, right, that's going to increase your predator population because there's more food available. But as the predator population goes up, now there are more predators to eat prey, and the prey population is going to fall. Then when the prey population falls, then there's not enough food. The predator population falls, and so on and so forth. And so you see these regular boom bust cycles. It goes up, it goes down. So now we're going to look at what we call R-selected and K-selected species. Different species have different reproductive strategies, meaning characteristics that have an effect of increasing the number of fertile offspring that they bear. For elephants, the strategy is to bring forth few offspring, but lavish attention on them. The time to birth is 2 years. So it requires a big investment of time to have an elephant be born. And so obviously then the elephants are going to do a good job taking care of their young. Their strategy, their reproductive strategy, is to not have babies as often, but to lavish a lot of attention on them to ensure that they survive. For houseflies, on the other hand, they take a different reproductive strategy. Their strategy is to bring forth a multitude of offspring, so they have a lot of offspring, but give no attention to any of them. The time to birth is only 1 month. So their goal or their strategy is just to have a lot of offspring. Don't necessarily, make sure that those offspring survive, but just have a lot of them, and then some of them are going to survive. So there are different reproductive strategies that different organisms use. So some species are said to be K-selected or carrying capacity selected, or equilibrium species. And these species tend to be physically large, so they're generally going to be bigger organisms. They experience their environment as relatively stable. So they don't have these dramatic effects as the environment changes. And these organisms will lavish a good deal of attention on relatively few offspring. So that would be like our elephant example. An elephant would be an example of a K-selected species. They're very large, they have very few offspring, but they're going to lavish a lot of attention on those offspring. The pressures on K-selected species tend to be what are called density dependent, meaning that as a population density goes up, factors that limit the population growth, food supply, living space, etc., exert themselves ever more strongly. And so that's going to be what's really going to dictate how a population size changes. Other species are said to be R-selected or opportunistic species. These species tend to be physically small, experience their environment as relatively unstable, give little or no attention to the numerous offspring that they bear. So again, these are going to be the organisms that will produce massive numbers of offspring. Now, the pressures on R-selected species tend to be density independent, meaning the pressures are unrelated to the population's density. It's not limited by the size of the population, but the forces at work in these populations tend to be physical forces. So frost, temperature, rain, as opposed to biological forces that operate in density-dependent control, which again would be competition for food, disease, etc. And so the R-selected species are the ones that are going to have more pressure based on their environment. And so this is just comparing the K-selected or equilibrium species with the R-selected or opportunistic species. So equilibrium species, their populations are going to stay right about carrying capacity. So because again, that's the maximum population size of that population that can be sustained for a period of time. So in this case, the population size is limited by the carrying capacity. It is density dependent, so it's dependent on the number of organisms in that environment. And the population size is relatively stable. You don't see large fluctuations typically in those populations. These are organisms that are larger, longer lived, produce fewer offspring, and provide greater care for their offspring. Our selected or opportunistic species will have, again, these up and downs in terms of their population. So their population size is going to be limited by the reproductive rate, so basically how quickly they can reproduce. It is density independent, so it's not really dictated by the number of organisms in that environment. The populations are relatively unstable, so again, you're going to see the populations fluctuate quite a bit. And these are going to be organisms that are smaller, short-lived, produce many offspring, but provide little to no care for those offspring. So like a dandelion, when they produce their seeds, they're not providing much care. It's just going to be blown by the wind and hope that some of those will start a new plant. So interestingly, if we compare the size of an organism with how long that there is between generations, one of the things that's interesting is that there is a correlation between the size of the organism and how quickly, basically between generations, how quickly they can reproduce. So E. coli, for example, they're very small. They can reproduce about every 20 minutes. So every 20 minutes, they reproduce and divide. If we look at a paramecium, this is a single-celled protist. It's relatively small, every approximately 1 day, right? And so notice that as you go up this graph, as the organisms get larger and larger in terms of body length, an overall trend that we see is that the time between generations is going to be greater. So like humans, for example, think of puberty. Early case scenarios, right? Teen years, but 20s, 30s, 40s would be the generation time. That's the amount of time it takes before reproduction can occur. And so that's just kind of an interesting little correlation. So it is somewhat dependent on the size of the organism. So question for you. The maximum population density of a species that an area can sustain over time is the red, ecological dominant, yellow, population bottleneck, green, carrying capacity, blue, population apex, or purple, ecological density. So think about your answer, push pause, and when you're ready, go ahead and push play to hear your answer. So if you said green carrying capacity, you would be correct, right? The carrying capacity, or the K, is the maximum population density that a species can sustain over time. We will talk later about ecological dominance. We've talked about a population bottleneck when we talked about our evolution. But for this one, the answer is the carrying capacity. And so now we're going to talk about survivorship curves. And these describe how soon species members tend to die within a species lifespan. And so there are 3 idealized types of survivorship curves. One is what we call late loss, type 1. These are organisms, like the name suggests, that tend to die later in life. So they will usually survive early ages, but will tend to die off at older ages. We can have what's called constant loss, which the rate at which these organisms die off is relatively constant. So that would be type 2. And we can have early loss, which is that the organisms tend to die at young ages. And so let's look at some examples. So members of late loss type 1 species tend to survive into old age. So if we notice, for example, if we look at an elephant, Most of them will survive the young ages. They're not going to tend to die very young, but the rate at which the population starts to die is when the organisms tend to get older. These tend to be our case-selected species because, again, they're going to lavish a lot of attention on their young, and therefore their young ages are going to tend to survive well, but they will die later in life. Members of constant loss, or type 2, tend to die off at a nearly constant rate throughout their lifespan. So like a bird, for example. Members of early loss species, or type 3, tend to have high death rates early in life, with these rates leveling off thereafter. And so a fly would be an example, right? Remember that the fly is going to be an R-selected species, and its method of reproduction, its reproductive strategy, is to produce a large number of offspring, but produce very little care for those offspring. So obviously then a lot of them are going to die off at young ages. But the ones that do survive can then survive to older ages. And so those would be an example of early loss or type 3 species. So now talking about populations, we need to think a little bit about human populations. So the Earth's human population did not reach the 1 billion mark until 1804. It then took 123 years to double to 2 billion, so in 1927, then only 48 years to double to 4 billion, and that was in 1974, and it has now reached 75 billion. And so if we look at this and we look over the history of people, notice that early on, the human population did not grow much. Why then did we have this big bust, or this big boom, I should say, in terms of population growth taking off? Well, because a lot of that has to do with improved sanitation, better medical care, and increases in the food supply. And so notice that especially once we started to get to this Industrial Revolution, the population really just started to take off. And so if we look at this over time, you can see that originally the rate at which the population increased was slower, and then it started to exponentially increase. Now, worldwide population growth rates reflect a mosaic of changes occurring in different countries, meaning that some countries are going to experience population growths, while other countries will experience population losses. And so in most developed nations, the overall growth rates are near zero. So they're not tending to have their population increase. They're not seeing their population decrease. The population is staying relatively constant. In the developing world, death rates have dropped and high birth rates have persisted, and therefore the population is going to increase more. So notice that if we compare in this table, the world, the growth rate is about 1.1%. If we look at more developed countries, growth rate is going to be 0.3%. But if we look at less developed countries, the growth rate is 1.3%. And so we're seeing a bigger growth rate in the less developed countries. Now, in terms of how we can predict, or what we can predict would happen to a population size, one of the things that we can look at is what's called a population pyramid, or an age structure. And so this is going to be an important step in calculating the future growth of a human population, is to learn what proportion of the population is at or under reproductive ages. So if we see a country like India, where it has a relatively high proportion of the population either under reproductive ages or at reproductive ages, what that means is that India is going to experience a population growth. Their population is going to increase as these younger individuals move into the reproductive years. That is going to make their population grow. They have a large percentage of their population at the younger ages. If we see it looking more stable in terms of its age structure, so notice in the United States, we have a relatively constant in terms of younger ages, middle ages, and even almost up to starting to approach elderly. As a result, the US is going to have a relatively stable population. Our population is not really growing a lot, and it's not decreasing either. It's staying relatively stable. If, on the other hand, you have a relatively high number of people at the older ages, so above reproductive years, for example, what's going to happen in that case is that your population is going to decline. Your population is going to go lower because as you get more people in elderly ages, the death rate is likely to be higher than the birth rate, and your population size you would expect to decrease. Now, following decades of explosive increase, the world's human population is projected to stabilize in the coming decades, going from about 6.5 billion years ago, that was in the early 2000s, to a maximum of about 9.2 billion just past mid-century. So that is estimated to be the carrying capacity of the human population. This stabilization is brought about by a decrease in the total fertility rate, informally defined as the number of children born on average to each woman in a population. And so nowadays, people are having less kids than before, whereas in earlier times, it was an advantage to have large number of children who could then help with the demands of farming, etc. But now we have relatively less kids than we did in previous times in our history. So this is looking at changes in fertility in different countries. So the darker orange is from 1960 to 1965. The more peach color is between 2000 and 2005. And so what you'll notice is this is the average number of children born per woman. So in Brazil, for example, the average woman had 6 children. That was average. Some had more, some had less. But if you compare between that and 2000, between 2000 and 2005, now the fertility rate is lower, meaning that on average, women in Brazil only have about 2 kids. Same thing in China, Thailand, Tunisia is a little bit higher. On average, women were having 7 kids compared to only 2 kids per woman now. And so this is going to change our age structure and our population dynamics. So the global reduction in fertility masks the enormous ongoing differences between fertility in more developed and less developed countries. Again, in less developed countries, we see population going up, but in more developed countries, it's staying relatively stable. And so fertility in less developed countries tends to be higher than in more developed countries. The fertility in most European nations is now so low that the continent's population stands to shrink significantly by mid-century, by about 75 million people. On the other hand, the South Asian country of Bangladesh, which is about the size of Iowa, just to give you an idea, is expected to have a population increase of more than 100 million people between 2005 and 2050. And so some populations are going to decrease, while other parts of the world, the population stands to increase dramatically. Now, the population of the United States, however, is projected to grow significantly during the same period, from about 300 million people in 2006 to about 420 million people in 2050, which is approximately a 40% increase. The primary factors bringing the U.S. increase about are immigration, so people moving into the U.S., and a total high fertility rate relative to other developed nations. So meaning that we still tend to have more kids per woman than many other developed nations. Now, some scientists believe that there's no greater single threat to the environment than the continued growth of the human population, right? Because as the human population grows, it's going to have a big effect. Others argue that a more important concern is actually the use of natural resources per person. And so this is just kind of an interesting example to show you. This is a family in a more rural area, and this is all of their belongings outside. And notice how minimal their belongings are. If you do the same thing and you take, a house in the US and you put everything outside, think about if you've ever moved. We have a lot of stuff. We use a lot of resources relative to other countries. And so scientists believe that is, a big part in the effect that humans have on the environment. So an ecological footprint is an estimate of the amount of land required to provide the raw materials an individual or population consumes. And this includes things like food, fuel, water, housing, waste disposal. So the red are going to be the regions where they have a high ecological footprint, meaning that they require a lot of land to provide the raw material. Now, if you look at this, interestingly, if you look at like Africa and you look at this and you go, well, why does that look so funky? Why that doesn't look like Africa? Because they scaled the countries or the continents to their ecological footprint. So the ones that had a very small ecological footprint, so Africa, South America, for example, parts of Asia, those areas have shrunk, right? So their ecological footprint is less. But if you look at North America and Europe and Australia, those countries tend to have a high ecological footprint. And so this is just to show you, that parts of the world require a lot of resources and other parts not as much. So, question for you. If the age structure of a population is an inverted pyramid, meaning that it's wider at the top and narrower towards the bottom, this indicates that the population over time will: red, rapidly rise; yellow, remain stable; green, slowly rise; blue, decrease; purple, none of the above. So think about your answer. Push pause, and when you're ready, push play to hear your answer. So if you said blue, decrease, you are correct. If you have a lot of people at older ages, because you have a lot of people at older ages, those people are more likely to die off, right? Your death rate is likely going to be higher than your birth rate. And as a result, your population is going to decrease over time. If your population, remember, has a lot at or below reproductive ages, then you would see your population increase. Or if you see kind of an even percentage of your population at different ages, then you would see a stable population. And so this is just talking about these age structures or these population pyramids. So now that we finished talking about populations, we are going to move on and talk about communities. And we're going to start by talking about the structure in communities. An ecological community is all of the populations of all of the species that inhabit a given area. So again, all the living things in that area. Many communities are dominated by only a few species. And the few species that are abundant in a given area are referred to as ecological dominance. So they comprise the most part of the living part of that community or that ecosystem. So here we have a German forest that's dominated by a single species of tree. Here we have a Kansas prairie that is dominated by tall grass. Notice there's not a lot of diversity there. So those organisms, those plants in this case, would be referred to as ecological dominance. Now, a keystone species is a species whose absence from a community would bring about a significant change in that community. Some keystone species are top predators in a community, meaning species that prey on other species but are not preyed on themselves, right? Because if you take away that top predator, for example, right, if that top predator was removed, now all of the things that it fed on are no longer being eaten, and those prey populations will increase. And it's really going to change the structure of the community. Now, keystone species need not to be top predators. However, every community does not have a keystone species. So it's not necessarily true that every population has one species that if you take it away is going to have a very great effect. So an example of a keystone species. So if we look at a predatory sea star and it was removed from a small area of rocky shore along the Pacific coast of the US, the species composition of the community changed drastically, more so than if any other species had been removed. The number of species in that community went from 15 to fewer than 5. And so when you remove that predatory sea star, then they started to have other organisms that started to increase in population size, and that really affected the community. And so it really decreased the amount of diversity within that community. Apart from ecological dominance in keystones, a third important element to any community is the range of species found within it. Biodiversity is defined as variety among living things, right? Bio, life, diversity, right? Variety. So a variety of life forms, and it takes 3 primary forms: a diversity of species in a given area, a geographical distribution of species populations, and genetic diversity within a species population. And so let's look at these 3 types of biodiversity. So first, we'll talk about how the number of species affects biodiversity. An area with many species is said to have high biodiversity. So if we look at this picture on the left, we have many different species. So we call this high biodiversity, versus an area with less number of different species would be said to have low biodiversity. In terms of species diversity, about 12% of the 9,934 known bird species are threatened. 20% of the 5,400 known mammalian species are threatened. This data, just to give you an idea, is about 10 years old, so it might be a little bit different now. 20% of known freshwater fish are extinct or seriously threatened. 32% of all known amphibians are extinct or seriously threatened. And about 10% of all known plant species are extinct or endangered. And so notice that a big problem is that we're starting to lose some of this biodiversity. We're starting to get less and less of certain organisms as they become extinct or start to become endangered. Now, in addition to the number of organisms in a particular environment, it also matters about the distribution of those species. Are they spread out or are they very narrow? So if they are broadly distributed, meaning they're kind of spread out, we would say that that is high biodiversity. If they're concentrated to one particular region, that would be low biodiversity. And so if you limit each species to a single population or a single area, species diversity would not drop. However, the earth would quickly become barren because what is needed is a rich distribution of species in a population across the planet. And so this is an example of how geographical diversity affects biodiversity. So again, you want to have this broad distribution of species across the earth. The last principle of biodiversity exists within populations of different species. It's the diversity of alleles or variants of genes in a population. So if you have a lot of different alleles, a lot of variations in the population, we would say that that has high biodiversity. However, if there are very few alleles in the population, there's not a lot of genetic diversity, that is said to have low biodiversity. Now, the problem with that is if genetic diversity is low within a population, meaning if the organisms have a lot in common and they're not very different, the population could be vulnerable to disease. Their members may die young or suffer from a variety of inherited mental and physical afflictions, right? And so if there's not a lot of diversity, you could start to have a lot of problems within that population. Recent research indicates that species diversity tends to enhance a community's productivity. Productivity is defined as the amount of solar energy that photosynthesizing organisms are able to capture and transform into living materials or biomass. And so remember that when we talked about ways that energy flows through an ecosystem, producers play an important role in this. They are the ones that are able to harness solar energy and to convert it into chemical energy. Without producers, consumers couldn't survive because then they would not have a food source to eat from. And so we need to have this biodiversity to have this productivity, these photosynthesizing organisms that are able to create food. Now, the reason that species diversity tends to enhance a community's productivity is because in a diverse community, each community member is able to exploit a different portion of resources available, meaning they're not necessarily competing for the same resource. Some plants will bloom early, while others will bloom late. Some plants will do well with only a little bit of water, while other plants flourish with more. If we look at bacteria in our gut, some of those bacteria will use sugars for food. Others will use proteins for food. They are what we call non-saccharolytic. They don't use sugars. They only use proteins. And what that does is that causes something called resource partitioning, where these different bacteria in the gut utilize different food sources, and therefore they're not competing for some limiting resource. They're utilizing different components within their environment. And so why are we losing biodiversity? You can think of this as HIPPO, habitat destruction. So as we start to develop and build more houses and other things, when we take away those habitats, right? When we take away that land, you're taking away the homes for some of those organisms, and they will start to die off and maybe become extinct. We can have invasive species. So non-native plants, for example, could be taken from one part of the world to another. And if that invasive species starts to take over, well, then now that's going to affect biodiversity, because that plant, for example, that shouldn't be there is going to take over the resources that the other plants that are already there might need. And that's going to affect biodiversity. Pollution, population of humans, right? So the number of people, and over exploitation. So using more resources than we actually need. And those are all things that can affect biodiversity. So now let's talk about types of interactions among community members. Interspecific interactions are the interactions between species. And interspecific interactions can be classified according to the effect on the populations concerned. A negative interaction occurs when two populations in a community compete for a common resource. And in that case, neither population is going to benefit from this interaction. It's going to have a negative effect on both. A positive interaction is one that's going to be mutually beneficial. such as between plants and their pollinators. Plants get the pollinators to move the pollen, and the pollinators get nectar as food. And so this is a positive interaction. It benefits both members. A positive negative interaction occurs when one population benefits and the other is harmed, such as predation, right? The predator is going to benefit from that interaction, but the prey is going to be negatively affected. And so we're going to look at some specific examples of these types of interactions. So there are 5 primary types of interactions among community members, and we're going to talk about all 5. So we'll start with our interspecific competition. We'll talk about mutualism, predation, parasitism, and herbivory. So a habitat can be thought of as the physical surroundings in which a species normally can be found. A niche is defined metaphorically as the organism's occupation, meaning what the organism does to obtain the resources that it needs to live. Example, the horseshoe crab has found a niche walking along the bottom of a shallow coastal waters, feeding on food items that range from algae to small invertebrates. So, first type of interaction is going to be interspecific competition. This is a negative interaction, meaning that neither organism benefits from this interaction. And so even though niches tend to be specific to a given organism, some species, particularly closely related species, have niche that overlap to some degree. And so what ends up happening is that we get this competition between these organisms, and this competition doesn't benefit either member. So the Virginia warbler niche, that's this one here, includes its nest sites and its nest building materials, the insects that it eats, the amount of precipitation, temperature, and humidity that enable it to survive. The niche of the orange crow warbler is similar. So they overlap and they compete for common resources. And by having this competition, this doesn't benefit either member of this community. And so when the two niches of two species overlaps greatly, it's unlikely that you're going to see a long-standing competition among them, meaning that usually one of the two members is going to win out in this case. And so the competitive exclusion principle states that when two populations compete for the same limited vital resource, one is always going to outcompete the other and thus bring about the latter's local extension. So if we look at two different species of paramecium, you can see that if you grow them separately, notice that both of them, their populations will increase, and then they will reach their carrying capacity and the population size is going to level off. However, if you grow them combined, so we have Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, when you culture these together, when you grow them together, what's going to happen is that they're both going to increase in population, but as they're competing for a resource, one is better adapted than the other. And the one that is well adapted, their population size is going to continue to increase. And the one that is not as well adapted, population size is going to decrease until eventually it becomes extinct. And so this would be an example of interspecific competition. So these two organisms are competing for a limited resource. And when they compete for that limited resource, that is not benefiting either member of that interaction. Both of them are negatively affected. So there are numerous instances in nature in which two related species use the same kind of resources from the same habitat over an extended period of time, but will divide up the resources such that neither of the species undergoes local extinction. And this phenomenon is called coexistent or sharing a habitat through resource partitioning, which can be defined as dividing up of scarce resources among species that have similar requirements. And so again, the example that I gave you would be like bacteria in the gut. The reason that numerous types of bacteria can coexist within the gut is that they find a way to divide up the resources so that they don't compete for all of the same resources, which would then drive one to become extinct. So an example of this would be, again, looking at that first experiment that I talked about. So if you grow these two species of paramecium separately, they both grow fine. However, if you grow them in culture together, remember that the paramecium caudatum is the one that's going to become extinct, because as they're competing for a common resource, one is going to win out and the other is going to die off. However, if you take paramecium aurelia and also grow it with paramecium bursaria, what you'll see is that in fact both organisms, both populations are going to grow. They're not competing for a limited resource. And that's because the paramecium bursaria had an advantage in the lower oxygen depleted water because it has symbiotic algae that grow with it, producing oxygen. And so they were able to divide up resources and divide up their habitats. The paramecium bursaria grew at the bottom and the paramecium aurelia grew at the top. And so that's how they were both able to sustain their continued population growth. So question for you, an organism's occupation, so how it gets food, avoids predators, is its red ecological range, yellow habitat, green keystone species, blue ecosystem, or purple niche. So think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, push play. If you said purple, it's niche, you would be correct, right? The niche is the organism's occupation, meaning how it gets the resources that it needs. Not a keystone species, because a keystone species is the species in the community, which if you take that out of the community is going to have the greatest effect on the community structure. So this is going to be purple, it's niche. So the next type of interaction among community members that we're going to talk about is going to be mutualism. And in mutualism, both species benefit from the interaction. One example is the mutualistic relationship of coral animals, so corals and animals, and the unicellular algae that live inside of their cells. The coral gains energy from the sugars produced by the algae, and the algae gain a secure shelter, access to light, carbon dioxide, and ammonia, which is a valuable source of nitrogen. And so that would be an example of a mutualistic relationship. There are plenty of mutualistic relationships where both members benefit. And so you could probably think of other ones as well. Next, we have predation and parasitism. Those are both positive, negative interactions. And what that means is that one member is going to benefit from that interaction and the other is going to be harmed. So predation is defined as one freestanding organism feeding on parts or all of a second organism. Note that the prey here can be animals, plants, protists, whatever is being preyed on. The predator is going to benefit from this interaction, but the prey is going to be harmed by this interaction. So it's a positive negative. Parasitism is a variety of predation in which the predator feeds on prey but does not kill it immediately or may not kill it ever. The prey of a parasite is known as a host. And so a parasite can use a host not only as a food source, but also as a vehicle to help facilitate its reproduction. So again, in this type of interaction, the parasite is going to benefit and the host is going to have a negative effect. And so if we think about worms, for example, that live in the gut, the worm is going to benefit. It's going to use the human as a host to help facilitate its reproduction. And that parasite is going to take food and take resources from the host. So that's parasitism. Now, an example of a parasitic plant, the orange tendrils in the picture belong to a species of dodder. It's a type of plant. It's a parasitic plant that survives by tapping into the food reserves of other plants, thus feeding on them. And the daughter is orange instead of green because it lacks the chlorophyll that is used in photosynthesis. And so if you've ever gone on hikes, for example, when I take students to Oak Canyon Nature Center in Anaheim Hills, if you go up on the hill, the part that's in full sun, you will in the springtime see a lot of this orange daughter, this parasitic plant that is using other plants as a food source. At Oak Canyon Nature Center, that parasitic plant really likes a type of plant called buckwheat. And so you'll often see it associated with the buckwheat, and it's basically taking food from the buckwheat. And so the daughter is benefiting from that interaction, and the plant that's being parasitized, in this case the buckwheat, would be negatively affected. So over evolutionary time, predator-prey interactions have spurred physical modifications in both predator and prey species. So if you think about predator adaptations, this is an example of this. This is a predatory frogfish, and it has this modified spine that resembles a worm. And so the spine that resembles a worm is to help attract prey to the fish, and then this predatory frogfish will eat that prey. So this is an adaptation that the predator got that basically allowed it to better get food. In terms of prey, right, interactions among predators and prey have also fueled adaptations in the prey as well. Adaptive coloration is a type of defense that has evolved in many species. And there are two main forms. One is referred to as warning coloration, and that is that these organisms have these brightly colored pattern, like in a poisonous dart frog, for example. And this is a way to warn predators that an animal has an effective chemical defense. It's warning coloration. It's basically warning predators, I'm brightly colored, you don't want to eat me. Cryptic coloration is basically camouflage. It's a way for the prey to hide from the predators. And in an earlier lecture, we looked at like the different types of mantids in Costa Rica and Malaysia, etc., and noticed that those different types of mantids had different coloration, which helped them camouflage into their environment, which makes it difficult for predators to find them. And so interactions among predators and prey can fuel adaptations in both predators and in prey. And so here are some other cool examples of animals that are avoiding predation through camouflage. This is a spanworm that looks like a twig on a maple tree. And so notice that this worm has this really cool appearance, which makes it look like the twig and helps to hide it from predators. A casquehead chameleon against a tree in Kenya. Notice it might take you a minute to find it, but it's right here. Here's its tail. And so notice that it blends in very well with its environment and it camouflages it so that it's harder for the predators to locate it. Now, one form that such modification takes is what's called mimicry. And this is a phenomenon in which one species has evolved to assume the appearance of another. One form of mimicry is called Batesian mimicry, and this occurs when one species evolves to resemble a species that has a superior protective capability. Batesian mimicry always includes three players: a mimic, a model, and what we call a dupe. The model has the superior protective ability. That's the one that actually has some physical characteristic that protects it. The mimic species evolves to match the appearance of the model species, which has the protective ability. So the mimic doesn't actually have that trait, but it evolved to look like the model so that predators will avoid it. The dupe species is deceived into believing that the mimic species is the model. So that's the predator. Basically, the dupe is the predator that's tricked into not eating the mimic because it thinks that it's the model, the one that has that superior protective ability. So this is looking at an example of Batesian mimicry. We have a yellow jacket wasp, which can be dangerous. But if we look here, this is a clear-winged moth, which doesn't have an ability to bite or sting, yet it resembles the yellow jacket wasp, which basically tricks the dupe, the predator, into thinking it is the wasp so that the wasp so that the moth will be left alone. In a second form of mimicry, Müllerian mimicry, several species that have protection against predators come to resemble each other. A would-be predator learns by interacting with an individual from one species to keep away from all individuals in any look-alike species. And the result is fewer individuals in these species will be killed or disturbed. So an example of this is that we have the South American butterfly from two different species, are different in some ways, but they share the characteristic of tasting bad to predators. And so over time, they evolved to look like each other, with their appearance serving as a warning to would-be predators to say, we don't taste good. And so notice that these two different species have evolved to look similar. Question for you. If two species of caterpillar that are both poisonous evolve to resemble each other, this is called red Müllerian mimicry, yellow commensalism, green behaviorism, blue Batesian mimicry, or purple competitive exclusion. So think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, go ahead and push play. So if you said Müllerian mimicry, you would be correct. They are both poisonous, so they've both evolved to have the same trait. And so that would be the Müllerian mimicry. It's not the Batesian, because in the Batesian mimicry, remember that one species has the protective ability and the other one does not. And in this case, they're both poisonous. So this is why this is Müllerian mimicry. And the last type of interaction is going to be herbivory, which is the consumption of plant parts or algae by an animal. Now, this is going to be a positive-negative interaction because obviously the organism that is eating the plant is going to benefit, but the plant is negatively affected. Now, as a result, plants have evolved numerous defenses against herbivory, which includes spines or thorns or chemical toxins to help deter against plant-eating animals. So this is just a summary of interactions among community members. So again, competition is a negative-negative. Both species are harmed by this interaction and neither is benefited. The next we have is mutualism, where it's a symbiotic relationship. Both are going to benefit from this interaction. We have predation, herbivory, parasites, etc. These are positive-negative interactions. One species is going to benefit and the other is going to be negatively affected. So in the process of nitrogen fixation, plants contribute food to bacteria that are capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen gas, and the bacteria can supply the plant with a usable force of nitrogen. This is an example of red parasitism, yellow mutualism, green fertilization, blue mimicry, or purple cooperative exclusion. So think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, push play. So the answer is going to be yellow mutualism. This is an interaction that benefits both organisms. The plant is going to provide food to the bacteria, and the bacteria is going to provide the plant with a usable form of nitrogen. So this interaction between the plant and the bacteria is a positive interaction. It benefits both members. It's not parasitism, because parasitism would have one being helped, meaning the parasite would benefit from it and the host would be harmed. That's not this case. They both benefit from this. It's not mimicry. Mimicry is where one organism mimics another. That's not what's happening here. And it's not cooperative exclusion, which is when we have two organisms that are competing for a common resource and it drives one to its local extinction. That's not happening here. This is mutualism. Both organisms are benefiting from this interaction. So now we're going to move on and look at how energy flows through an ecosystem. So we talked about population ecology, we talked about communities, and now we're going to move on more large scale and talk about ecosystems. So a simple terrarium is a microcosm that exists that exhibits the two major processes that sustain all ecosystems. We have energy flow, and you might recall that we learned about this back in chapter 1, that energy flow is unidirectional. It flows in one way and out another. The energy that comes in is going to be solar energy, so energy from light. The energy that leaves is going to be heat. So we can look at it through the idea of energy flow, as well as chemical cycling, the use and reuse of chemical elements such as carbon and nitrogen within the ecosystem. And remember that chemicals are going to cycle through an ecosystem. They're just continually being reused in different forms by different organisms. And so we're going to look at these various types of methods. So if we look at trophic levels, plants and other photosynthesizers are an ecosystem's producers, while the organisms that eat the plants are the consumers, an organism that eats other organisms rather than producing its own food. And so every ecosystem has a number of feeding or trophic levels, with producers forming the first trophic level and consumers forming several additional levels. So again, if we look at the way that food moves through an ecosystem, so let's say we're looking at a terrestrial food chain versus an aquatic food chain. So the producers are the organisms that are able to make food. So like doing photosynthesis, for example. So a plant would be a producer, or phytoplankton would be a producer. Now, an herbivore is an animal that only eats plants, algae, or phytoplankton. So they could occupy the second trophic level, and they would be considered primary consumers. So primary consumers are ones that eat the producers. Now we can then have a secondary consumer, and a secondary consumer is what eats the primary consumer. So it occupies the third trophic levels. When we say an animal is a carnivore, it's an animal that eats only meat. It eats other animals. An omnivore is an animal that eats both plants and animals. So if you are not vegetarian, you would be an omnivore. It's not likely you're a carnivore where you only eat meat. You likely eat a mixture of plants and animals. And so you would be considered an omnivore. Now, the organisms that eat the secondary consumers, we call the tertiary consumers. Those occupy the fourth trophic level. Then we have quaternary consumers. Those eat the tertiary consumers. They occupy the fifth trophic level. And so you end up with these food chains, and in actuality, you're going to see in a minute that what you actually end up with is more of a food web. So this is an example of a food web. Again, these organisms at the bottom here, these are going to be your producers. These are the ones that are going to do photosynthesis, for example, and they're going to make food. Now, these producers get eaten by these primary consumers. So like a snail would be a primary consumer, and a frog tadpole would be a primary consumer. Then the animals that eat this primary consumer would be a secondary consumer. So we have our garter snake, we have our newt. Those are the secondary consumers. So the garter snake is eaten by the great blue heron. So if this is the secondary, the great blue heron in this case is the tertiary. Now, one of the things to notice is if you look at the great blue heron, it can occupy multiple trophic levels. Notice that the arrows coming to it are either yellow or blue or red. So that tells you what level of the food chain that they're in. So notice that the frog tadpole would be the primary, which means in this case, the great blue heron is the secondary. When we talk about the garter snake was the secondary. So notice the red arrow, the great blue heron is tertiary. If we're talking about this part where the yellow is, that is not a secondary and not a tertiary, but a quaternary, because so if we look along this food chain, This one is the primary. This is the secondary. This is the tertiary, which means that the great blue heron in this case is the quaternary. So in some instances, organisms can occupy more than one trophic level. They can act as different components in a food chain. Now, a detrivore is a class of consumer that feeds on the remains of dead organisms or cast off materials from living things. A decomposer is a special kind of detrivore that breaks down dead or cast off organic materials into its inorganic components, which can then be recycled through an ecosystem. And so decomposers, for example, could be fungi. Some bacteria can act as decomposers. So these are organisms that basically feed on dead, decaying matter. All living things will be broken down into component materials, which will then be used again. However, human beings are currently putting things into the environment that are not biodegradable, meaning capable of being decomposed by living organisms. So if something is not biodegradable, it means that it can't be broken down by living things. Of particular concern here are the plastics, many of which will remain intact for hundreds of years following their production. Now, remember that all organisms, all living things require energy, and that energy is needed for growth, for maintenance, for reproduction, and in many species for locomotion or movement or motility. The energy flow model measures energy as it's used by and transferred among different members of an ecosystem. Now, when an organism takes in food, so in this case, the plant is being eaten by the caterpillar. And let's say that this plant provides the caterpillar with 100 kilocalories of energy. Now, the caterpillar is not able to utilize all of that energy to make ATP. Energy transfer is never 100%. So notice in this case, maybe 35 kilocalories goes to cellular respiration, about 15 might go to growth, but notice about half is excreted as feces. And so energy transfer is never going to be 100%. A lot of times in organisms, some of that energy is lost as heat. And so we saw this in lab when we did our cellular respiration lab, and we looked at our seedlings, right? And our seedlings in the thermometer or in the thermos gave off more heat than the control. And it was because the seedlings do respiration, and some of the energy that's lost is provided as heat. Now, the amount or mass of living organic material in an ecosystem is referred to as its biomass. And the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy into chemical energy that is stored in biomass is called primary production. And different ecosystems will vary considerably in their primary production. And so some ecosystems will have a lot of primary production, meaning they have a lot of producers that can convert solar energy into chemical energy, and then other ecosystems that have very little primary productivity. So tropical rainforest, which is going to be very diverse in plants, has a lot of primary productivity. But a desert, on the other hand, right, has very little green plants and therefore is not going to be high in terms of its primary productivity. It's not going to have a lot of biomass because it's not going to have a lot of productivity in terms of food being produced. So a pyramid of production illustrates the cumulative loss of energy with each transfer in a food chain. And the energy level available to the next higher level ranges anywhere from 5 to 20%. So what that means is that the organism, when they take in food, they're only utilizing on average between 5 to 20% of that energy. In this particular diagram that you're seeing here, it's illustrated as 10%, meaning that the organisms are only able to extract 10% of the energy. So if we have 1,000,000 kilocalories of sunlight, producers, for example, might be able to utilize 10,000 kilocalories. And then 10% of that is by the primary consumer. So they're able to utilize about 1,000 of that 10,000 that they take in. And then the secondary consumer eats the primary, they get only 10% of that. The tertiary eats the secondary, they get only 10% of that. And so notice that the farther we go up the food chain, the less efficient the energy transfer is going to be. And so the energy available to the top level consumers is small compared to the energy level available to the lower level consumers. And so this is why top level consumers require more geographic area. They need to take in more food often to be able to sustain them. And most food chains are limited to 3 to 5 levels. Once you get above 5 levels, typically the amount of energy that is available is so low that it can't be sustained. Now, the dynamics of energy flow applies to human populations as much as it does to other organisms. So when humans eat plants, we are primary consumers, right? So if we look at vegetarians, we are primary consumers. And so they're able to extract a lot of energy from the plants. But if we eat beef or other meat from herbivores, we are secondary consumers. And if we eat fish like trout or salmon, we are tertiary consumers. And so again, organisms can occupy more than one trophic level. So, question for you. There's a simple food chain living in a river in Northern California. Green algae are consumed by frog tadpoles, which themselves are consumed by the great blue heron. The great blue heron is a blank and occupies the blank trophic level in this ecosystem. Red, tertiary consumer, 4th. Yellow, secondary consumer, 4th. Green, tertiary consumer, 3rd. Blue, secondary consumer, 3rd. Or purple, primary consumer, 3rd. So think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, push play. So if you said blue, secondary consumer, and the 3rd trophic level, you would be correct. So in this example, green algae would be our producers, right? They're the ones that are responsible for making the food. And so they would occupy the 1st trophic level. The frog tadpole eats the algae. So the frog tadpole would be a primary consumer. It occupies the 2nd trophic level. The great blue heron eats the primary consumer, which makes the great blue heron a secondary consumer, and it occupies the 3rd trophic level. A dung beetle, can you guess what it eats, is an example of red, a detrivore, yellow, an omnivore, green, a carnivore, blue, an autotroph, or purple, a homeotherm. So take a minute, think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, push play. So if you said red, a detrivore, you would be correct. Dung beetle eats dung, which is another word for feces. That is dead, cast off material. So that would be a detrivore that would eat that. An omnivore, right? An omnivore means that it eats plant and animals. That's not what this eats. A carnivore eats animals. An autotroph makes its own food, and homeotherm has nothing to do with this. So it's red, detrivore. So now we're going to look at how chemicals cycle through an ecosystem. And so biogeochemical cycles involve both the biotic components, meaning the living parts of an ecosystem, and the abiotic components form what's called an abiotic reservoir, where a chemical accumulates or is stockpiled outside of living organisms. So this abiotic reservoir could be in rocks, for example. It could be in gas in the atmosphere. There are many abiotic reservoirs that are possible. And so this is just looking at an example of the way that a particular chemical might move through an ecosystem, right? So nutrients are available to the producers. When the consumers eat the producers, they get that energy. When the consumers and the producers die, decomposers break it down, that can go back into the abiotic reservoir, and the cycle can keep continuing. And so this is just showing kind of a generalized biogeochemical cycle. So in this one, we are looking at the carbon cycle. And so the carbon cycle is how carbon moves through the ecosystem. So we have carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. And remember that our producers are autotrophs, so plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are able to do photosynthesis. So they're able to take the carbon dioxide, the water, and sunlight, and they're going to convert that solar energy into chemical energy. So they're going to take that CO2 and they're going to fix it into glucose. They're going to make sugars. So now the carbon is fixed into glucose in the plants. Now, primary consumer comes along, it eats the plant. It gets its carbon from the plant because the plant is going to provide sugars, proteins, etc. So the primary consumers eat the producers, and that's how they get their carbon. Higher level consumers eat the primary consumer, for example, and they get the carbon that way. Now, these organisms can do cellular respiration. And when they do cellular respiration, right, and they break down the food that they eat, they are going to release carbon into the atmosphere, back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So that there is its own little loop. And then furthermore, when these plants and animals die, right, when they die, they will form this detritus, this dead cast-off material, and decomposers can then break down those dead cast-off animals and utilize the carbon in the animals. They will break that down. They will do decomposition, release CO2 back into the atmosphere, as well as burning of wood and fossil fuels also introduces CO2 into the atmosphere. And so notice that in the carbon cycle, the major abiotic reservoir is going to be the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These other components, right? These other components are all part of the biotic part of this ecosystem. But the major reservoir for carbon is going to be, the abiotic reservoir is going to be CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So I have a video to just kind of summarize what happens in the carbon cycle.
Could a carbon atom that was once part of Albert Einstein be in you? All living things need to take in carbon-containing molecules to fuel their activity and build their cells. This is true for busy students and for all organisms. Let's look at how carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle in the Arctic tundra. Carbon atoms from carbon dioxide are incorporated into living things by producers, such as this plant. Carbon dioxide enters a leaf, moves into a cell, and goes into a chloroplast. There, in the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is used to make sugar molecules. The sugars can be used to build larger carbon-containing molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In this way, carbon that was in the air is now part of the plant. When a plant is eaten by an herbivore, or primary consumer, carbon in plant tissue enters the primary consumer's digestive system. There, plant molecules are broken down. These small molecules are then used by the primary consumer to make larger molecules for building its own tissues. In this way, some of the carbon that was in a plant becomes carbon in a primary consumer. Similarly, when a primary consumer is eaten by a higher-level consumer, some of the carbon in the primary consumer is incorporated into the higher-level consumer. Carbon-containing molecules in dead plant material, animal feces, and dead organisms are taken up by decomposers, such as fungi and bacteria. Decomposers break down these materials and incorporate some of the carbon atoms into their own bodies. We have now seen how carbon moves from carbon dioxide to producers, to primary consumers, to higher-level consumers, and to decomposers. How does carbon get back to the atmosphere? During cellular respiration, carbon-containing molecules are broken down, and ATP is made. Carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct and returned to the atmosphere by producers, consumers, and decomposers. Overall, this return of carbon dioxide by cellular respiration is closely balanced by its removal from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The global carbon cycle involves living things on land and in rivers, lakes, and oceans. And by the way, considering the huge number of carbon atoms in each person and how quickly carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle, there is almost certainly a little of Einstein in each of us.
So we just looked at how carbon cycles through an ecosystem. Now we're going to look at how phosphorus cycles through an ecosystem. Organisms require phosphorus as an ingredient to make nucleic acids, phospholipids for cell membranes, as well as ATP. Phosphorus is also required as a mineral component of vertebrate bones and teeth. And the major abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is in rocks. So if we look at the way that phosphorus cycles through an ecosystem, we have phosphates that are going to be found in rocks and in soil and in solution. And that abiotic reservoir of phosphorus can be uplifted by the rocks, and then the weathering of the rocks is going to allow it to kind of come down and into the rocks. In the soil, the phosphates are assimilated into the plants. The plants are going to take in that phosphate. Then animals are going to eat the plants, and the animals get the phosphate that way. Plants and animals die. They decompose in the soil, and then we get back to having phosphates in the soil, and the cycle can keep continuing. Now let's look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is an ingredient found in proteins and nucleic acids. And it is essential to the structure and functioning of all organisms. Organisms need a source of nitrogen. Nitrogen has two abiotic reservoirs: the atmosphere, which is about 78% nitrogen gas, and the soil. Now, interestingly, a big player in terms of playing an important role in the nitrogen cycle is bacteria. Because bacteria are one of the only types of organisms that can fix atmospheric nitrogen, meaning they can utilize N2 gas, and they fix it through a process referred to as nitrogen fixation. And those nitrogen fixing bacteria can then produce ammonium. And then the plants can assimilate that through the ammonium that's produced by the bacteria. We also have what are called nitrifying bacteria that take ammonium and will produce nitrates. And then we have denitrifying bacteria, which will take the nitrates and put nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Now, when the plants take in the ammonium, then the animals get it from the plants by eating the plants. When plants and animals break down, they turn into detritus, which is then decomposed by decomposers back to ammonia. And the process can keep continuing. And so nitrogen is going to cycle through an ecosystem. And we need bacteria for part of this cycle because, again, bacteria are the only organisms that are able to do nitrogen fixation, taking atmospheric nitrogen and fixing it into a usable form that other organisms can then utilize. And so early in the 20th century, an industrialized process was invented for producing a biologically useful form of nitrogen, one that can be applied to agricultural crops as fertilizer. And so with this step, human beings became an important participant in the Earth's nitrogen cycle because artificially, we could then add nitrogen to the ecosystem. However, nitrogen runoff from agriculture can be a form of nutrient pollution that can harm both small and large aquatic ecosystems. And so this use of nitrogen as fertilizer has also damaged ecosystems. And so the nitrogen runoff brings a seasonal bloom of algae. Bacteria then feed on the algae when it dies, and the bacteria use up most of the available oxygen at water's lower depths. And what this essentially does is this results in this giant dead zone, and it drives away mobile fish and it kills immobile bottom dwelling sea creatures. And so if you look at this runoff down the Mississippi River, for example, by all these farming lands, and when we have this runoff, it flows into the Gulf of Mexico and it creates this large dead zone. And so this dead zone is where we have this abundance of nitrogen and this bloom of algae basically and bacteria, and then that basically is going to make it so that a lot of life forms can't live in this region. And so this Gulf of Mexico then became this dead zone because of nitrogen runoff, and so humans are playing a detrimental role to the ecosystem in that by adding in nitrogen to fertilizer, that it's creating problems in the ecosystem. So, question for you. In nature, it is blank that are primarily responsible for converting atmospheric nitrogen into a form that living things can use. Red, plants; yellow, algae; green, bacteria; blue, animals; or purple, fungi. So pause your video, think of your answer, and when you're ready, push play. The answer is green, bacteria. Bacteria are primarily responsible for taking atmospheric nitrogen into gas and converting it into a usable form. And without bacteria, this cycle would not exist properly. And so we need bacteria to be part of this process. And so this concludes our lecture on ecology, and we are done.